Okay, so good afternoon, everyone who is attending this webinar live. And for those of you watching the recording, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As you all know, today's topic is on chronic fatigue syndrome. And we're really going to dive into the numerous underlying imbalances or causes to this condition. Before we do that, I just want to very briefly introduce myself for those of you that don't yet know me. My name is Alex Manos. I am one of the co-founders of HealthPath, and I'm an Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner. So my background is more in the nutrition space. I have a master's in personalized nutrition and a degree in nutritional therapy. And I actually did my master's dissertation on the topic of glucocorticoid resistance in chronic fatigue syndrome, which really is focused on cortisol. So cortisol being one of those stress hormones that many of us are familiar with. And I dived into the research looking at the role that cortisol can play within chronic fatigue syndrome and what drives some of this resistance. So many of us know the basics of insulin resistance and diabetes, whereby the insulin hormone isn't able to communicate with the receptors as efficiently. And the same is true with cortisol and some of these stress hormones. If we have been producing excessive amounts of cortisol over a prolonged period of time, that can actually contribute to this same cellular resistance that we see in things like insulin resistance. So we'll be talking about cortisol and adrenal function a little bit in today's webinar. And I'm also just the host of the HealthPath podcast, where we get experts on the show, such as Dr. Sarah Myhill, who many of you will know as one of the leading experts in chronic fatigue syndrome. So the objectives today, as mentioned, are really to explore the numerous underlying imbalances that in the research have been discussed as contributing to chronic fatigue syndrome. And we can actually lean on this paper written by my colleague, Benjamin Brown. And although this was written a while ago now within the context of how evidence evolves, it was published in 2014, it is still 100% accurate and relevant for our presentation today. So we have to be thinking about various bodily systems and various processes and various lifestyle factors. So for example, we know that nutritional deficiencies can contribute to fatigue-based conditions. We have to be mindful of how people with chronic fatigue syndrome respond to exertion. We have to be very mindful of the psychological stress that can contribute to chronic fatigue syndrome and how there's a little bit of a vicious cycle from this perspective. But we also see in the research that certain environmental toxins, certain imbalances within the digestive system, within the immune system, and specifically within our mitochondria, all contribute to this condition. Now, if you're not yet familiar with mitochondria, these are essentially a subcomponent of all of our cells. So they're referred to as an organelle. They are found inside the cell, and it is literally here where our energy is created. And therefore, we could argue that almost the core of chronic fatigue syndrome is some degree of mitochondrial dysfunction, because as the name suggests, someone with this diagnosis just has an energy production deficiency. They're not able to generate enough energy at the cellular level to support their sort of optimal functioning. So if we look into this a little bit more, we can see that Benjamin Brown created this table within the paper. And again, we're going to be diving into a lot of this today. You can see specific nutrients that we need to be particularly mindful of, certain hormones that we may need to be mindful of, as well as the environmental toxins, GI and immune dysfunction that is heavily written about within the research. Now, we can take it almost one step further. This is a visual, and apologies, the focus is a little bit off. This is sort of a screenshot from a slides. It is created by a very well-known doctor called Dr. Karazian, and I've been given permission to share this image. because it shows you that, again, when we think functionally, or when we take a functional medicine approach to evaluating someone who suffers with fatigue, there are numerous things that have to be considered, but they're all contributing to this reduced ability to produce ATP, which is often described as our energy currency. ATP is the source of our energy. It's what gives us our life. And you can see on the left-hand column, these are, in the little white box, the sort of primary bodily systems. So we have our transportation, which is kind of like our cardiovascular system. We have our energy producing system and sugar regulation. The defense and repair is related to our immune system, assimilation related to our digestive system, biotransformation related to our detoxification system, communication is related to our hormonal system, and then kind of our structural system. Integrity of other tissues within the body as well. And essentially the lists underneath these are the things that we need to be thinking about. So let's just focus on assimilation and digestion to begin with. Impaired digestive enzymes, poor vagal tone, imbalances within our gut microbiome, which is often referred to as dysbiosis. These imbalances within the digestive system, which we can test for via things like a comprehensive gut stool analysis, can lead to a reduction in nutrient absorption, and therefore a lack of nutrients that are required to support our mitochondria. Remember, the mitochondria are the site of energy production in the cell. And if the mitochondria don't have the building blocks required to produce our energy, we see low ATP output. And that really is just saying that we have low energy output. So this is another really helpful visual, certainly for myself as a practitioner, that I can use when I'm trying to help someone understand what in your unique situation is contributing to your chronic fatigue. Now, if we think about the fact that in chronic fatigue syndrome, we are essentially talking that at a subcellular level, we have an issue with energy production. It is therefore very obvious that chronic fatigue syndrome is a multi-system disorder. It can impact your digestive system, your immune system, your nervous system, with things like brain fog and poor cognition. And that's because there's a lack of energy. So we see numerous symptoms and numerous systems being impacted in chronic fatigue syndrome. And this is why it can be such a debilitating condition for those with it. Now, when we take a functional medicine perspective, there is something called the matrix. And this is essentially a document that functional medicine practitioners often use as a way to brainstorm and mind map each of their unique clients. And we're going to use this as a bit of a framework for today's webinar. So we're going to take a wander around the matrix, starting with what we refer to as antecedents. Antecedents are things that may actually predispose us to developing whatever condition we're talking about. So one of the things that we need to be mindful here is that there is actually evidence indicating that what we refer to as adverse childhood events can be a risk factor for people to go on to develop chronic fatigue syndrome. Adverse childhood events in the research have been broken down into both emotional and physical abuses. This can be emotional neglect, it can be physical neglect, it can be physical harm, but it can also be related to our home environment. So for example, the relationship that our parents have, did we witness drug use or did we witness any violence? These adverse childhood events in the research, there is a threshold of 4, meaning that as a child, if you experienced 4 or more of these types of adverse childhood events, you have a significantly increased risk of going on to develop not just chronic fatigue syndrome, but the majority of conditions that we see frequently in the modern Western world: autoimmune diseases, cancer, fibromyalgia, IBS, inflammatory bowel disease. The reason being is our nervous system is particularly susceptible when we're very young. And we're often talking about 7, 8 years old, but I would argue that we can go a little bit older based on my clinical experience here as well. And if your nervous system is sensing an environment which is incredibly stressful, it will develop a very efficient stress response. You could go to the extreme of using the example of post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone with PTSD may hear a car backfire and they have a huge stress response as a result. Every time we initiate our stress response, there's a little bit of wear and tear that happens at a cellular level. And therefore, the more frequently we're initiating our stress response, and the more acutely that stress response is, or the more profound it is, the more wear and tear we accumulate as we go through life. And I'm a huge advocate for this concept that both health and dis-ease are accumulative in nature. We have to be thinking about our entire life journey to help us truly understand our current state of health, sitting or standing here today. So if we've experienced these early adverse childhood events, we just have an increased risk of experiencing illness later in life. So this is something that we always need to be mindful of. As a practitioner, when I'm working with a client, I need to have some level of understanding about what their childhood was like. It's not that I'm going to pretend to be a therapist and support them through that process, but it may be that I feel that it would benefit from a referral. And it also helps our understanding physiologically about how we can support this person move forward. And these connections have been found 30 years apart. So childhood abuse or neglect 30 years later dictates and predicts how much wear and tear that person is experiencing. And wear and tear in the research, they often use this term allostatic loads, which is literally really the amount of wear and tear that you've experienced. I would argue that almost any biomarker or test you do, whether it's looking at cortisol, whether it's looking at blood pressure, whether it's looking at the microbiome, to some degree, they're all giving us insight into your allostatic load. So we do have to go back to the early years for us to truly understand why someone may be experiencing chronic fatigue syndrome. But in this paper, also published in 2014, they summarized and reviewed the predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating factors. And there is a genetic component, and that's partly around some of these resiliency genes and stress genes. Some of us can be genetically predisposed to metabolizing our stress hormones slower than others. I'm one of them. And what that means practically is when I generate a stress response, when I perceive myself to be under stress and I have a release of cortisol and adrenaline into the system, they basically hang around in my blood longer than someone who doesn't have the same genetic variations that I do. And therefore, some of us are essentially more susceptible to greater levels of wear and tear as a result of stresses in our lives. But we'll be touching on some of these other ones as we move through today's presentation. Interestingly, our personality has been associated with various health conditions. There is some really fascinating research on this. And for those of you that know or don't know Dr. Gabor Mate, he has a brilliant book. It's entitled When the Body Says No. And sort of one of the themes within the book is exploring the research around how our personality may influence the development and onset of disease. And personality can be related to things like self-esteem, high expectations and attributions. Our parental involvement and care can influence these things. And then hormones, our activity levels, sleep, and things like infections and our body mass can all influence chronic fatigue syndrome. So when we think about the personality side of things, where we come to really the core of the matrix, I'm a huge advocate of the mind-body connection these days. Having been in clinical practice for 15 years, the sort of physiological and physical things are incredibly important, but we really need to be mindful about what's going on in our mental, emotional, and spiritual lives. Because there is a very clear theme around psychological subtypes. I 3 or 4 years ago spoke to Alex Howard, who is kind of co-founder of the Health Optimization Clinic. And he talks about a helper, an achiever, a trauma, and an anxiety type when it comes to chronic fatigue syndrome. And there is an overlap certainly between helper types and achiever types. Interestingly, I kind of would argue that nutritional therapists, healthcare practitioners are often helper types. We love to help. And sometimes we love to help so much that we don't have very good boundaries. We overwork, for example. And as a result, a lot of health practitioners can flirt with their own chronic fatigue syndrome or / burnouts. So this psychological subtype of being a real helper and not necessarily having healthy boundaries, not prioritizing our own self-care, can be real risk factors when it comes to chronic fatigue syndrome. Alongside that, to some degree, is the achiever type, someone who is just incredibly focused on achievement, on doing. They never rest. They're always up early. Even at the weekends, they're trying to achieve things. Then there's no real downtime. This I see quite a lot with adolescents. I've worked with a lot of clients with chronic fatigue syndrome over the years, and one of the most common situations is someone in secondary school who is either an athlete or an academic or sometimes both, and they've essentially just been doing far too much. They haven't been nourishing themselves to the capacity they need to be because of how much they're doing, and they again reach burnout. We've already sort of touched on the trauma type, and then there's the anxiety type, which you could argue is almost a chronic stress, chronic hypervigilance, wear and tear situation that can develop. So we really have to be mindful of our personality and our subtype from a psychological perspective. There's also research around neuroticism and perfectionism with fatigue, which again makes sense essentially. If you are a perfectionist, you are often an achiever or an overachiever, not able to let things go. And think of the rigidity, think of the low level or high level stress that can come with that sort of personality. The good news is personality isn't actually as fixed as we once thought. So again, it's not a huge barrier, it's not an obstacle. These are things that we can modify. And that's the beauty of all of this research ultimately. So what about nutrition and nutrients? Well, there isn't a huge amount of direct research on this yet. But what we do see is a response and a relationship between B vitamins and chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. It does seem that a subset of people with CFS do have numerous deficiencies, in particular of the B vitamins, but in my clinical experience of many other nutrients as well, ranging from antioxidants through to some of our minerals like magnesium and zinc. We need to be mindful that if we're pescatarian, vegetarian, or vegan, that we have an increased risk of an iron deficiency, and iron is absolutely essential for energy production. So there is a very intimate nutrition-nutrient relationship with chronic fatigue syndrome as well. And going back to Benjamin Brown's paper, in the research, we see relationships between vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, magnesium, zinc, and the B vitamins, like we mentioned, and also the amino acid carnitine. But while on the topic of nutrition, we need to be mindful that food sensitivities and food allergies can also contribute to fatigue-based sort of conditions and fatigue-based symptoms. So sometimes if we're having an adverse reaction to a food, we will experience some of these sorts of symptoms as well. Now, bear in mind, before we move into assimilation, which is our digestive system, when we think about the mitochondria, we mentioned them earlier, they're the site in the cell where energy is literally created. they are dependent on various nutrients as well, many that we've already mentioned, and there are others as well. So some of you who have done some reading around chronic fatigue will know, just as one example, that the antioxidant CoQ10 is often recommended, and it's also essential for healthy mitochondrial function. So again, these nutrients have a role to play at a subcellular level within the production of energy. A very kind of naturopathic principle that I think is a really helpful way to think about all of these things is, what does the body need more of, and what does the body need less of, or what do we need to get rid of, as a way to support the innate healing capacity of the human body? What do we need more of? What do we need less of? And that is fundamentally what we are always doing at the most basic of levels. So let's dive into gut health and its relationship with chronic fatigue syndrome based on what we have in the research. Well, we see that there are imbalances and changes to the gut microbiome. So all of those organisms, primarily in our large intestine, they have been shown in numerous studies that there are imbalances here that can contribute to chronic fatigue syndrome. So the large intestine needs to be considered, and that's where our gut testing can be really helpful. Not only do we see imbalances within the composition of the microbiome, we often see reduced diversity within the microbiome. And this is thought by many to be one of the most important metrics of gut health. The idea being that a diverse microbiome is a resilient microbiome. A resilient microbiome is one that is resistant to changes when a stressor is put into the mix. The easy example being antibiotics. So the more diverse your microbiome at the onset of a course of antibiotics, the less impact that course of antibiotics is going to have within that ecosystem. And this is obviously a almost universal principle. The greater the diversity to any ecosystem, the more resilient it is. That diversity can be supported through a diverse diet. It can be supported by physical activity, if that's appropriate for the individual. It can be supported by being in more rural environments compared to urban environments, and it can be influenced by spending more time outside. There are numerous things that we can do to support that diversity. Now, it shouldn't be too surprising that as a result of what we've just mentioned, we also see that leaky gut has been associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. There are at least a handful of studies that have looked into this. And in fact, a researcher called Michael Mize, who is one of the authors of this paper on this slide, has a couple of papers that he's released over the years, whereby they've taken a group of people with chronic fatigue syndrome, they've confirmed that these individuals have leaky gut, and they've put them on a program which is designed to heal that intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut. And in these studies, they were given various antioxidants, things like glutamine, zinc, and NAC. They were given what they referred to, the authors, as a leaky gut diet. And this was a kind of paleo elimination style diet. And in these studies, they were also actually given intravenous immunoglobulins. Now, one of the things that is important to be mindful of with this study is, from memory, it was a 12 to 14 month process. You know, this wasn't a 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 month protocol. They did this for an extended period of time, but they saw significant improvement, not only in the leaky gut, but also the symptoms around chronic fatigue syndrome. We also see in the research evidence indicating that inflammation and hydrogen sulfide have been associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. And we've already mentioned the leaky gut and mitochondrial dysfunction. So inflammation can be caused by numerous things. If we're talking about gut inflammation, that can be caused by imbalances within the microbiome. It can be caused by some form of infection within the microbiome. And obviously it can be associated with inflammatory bowel disease if the inflammation is very acute. Hydrogen sulfide is a gas that is produced by certain bacteria. We all have those bacteria within our large intestine. The question is, are we producing excessive amounts of hydrogen sulfide? There are different theories why this may be, and if you are interested in this, then I highly recommend listening to the podcast I did with Dr. Greg Nye, who is sort of an expert in the hydrogen sulfide piece of the puzzle, and really helped, I think, push the awareness of hydrogen sulfide as a potential problem within both irritable bowel syndrome, but also with chronic fatigue syndrome. Dr. Sarah Myhill also talks about this. She talks about the fermentative gut as a core component of chronic fatigue syndrome. So we see a lot around the gut. There is one final piece of the puzzle from a digestive perspective, and that is Sibo. So in this study, 77% of patients with chronic fatigue syndrome had small intestine bacterial overgrowth, which is a significant number. We're talking about 3/4 of this cohort had Sibo. And we do have some intervention studies indicating that by eradicating this overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine, we see improvement in fatigue-based issues. So that provides us some fairly strong evidence that in a subset of people, improve the health of the small intestine and you improve the systemic health of the individual as well. Then we can think about exercise. Now, this is still a pretty hot topic within the world of chronic fatigue syndrome. And I think rather than get too bogged down really in the research and the evidence, I think it's important just to appreciate that everyone's going to have their own unique response to exercise. And there has to be a little bit of a trial and error because we all have a different level of functioning, even with the diagnosis of chronic fatigue syndrome. Some are literally bedbound with it. Others are still working, but having to sleep 16 hours a night at the weekends so they can go through the next week of work. So there's a large spectrum when it comes to chronic fatigue syndrome. But what we see in clients or patients or study participants who have chronic fatigue syndrome compared to healthy individuals is a change within how they respond to exercise. There's a more pronounced response to certain components of the immune system. We see greater levels of oxidative stress and reduced antioxidant responses. And with that in mind, when we exercise, we normally expect to see an upregulation of our endogenous, our internal antioxidant systems. So we think about things like vitamin A and vitamin C and zinc as being antioxidants, which they are, but we also produce our own. We have our own endogenous antioxidants, molecules and systems ultimately. And there's an imbalance within this system in those with CFS. So actually, rather than exercise providing an improvement and a benefit here, it can actually tip us over the edge and create a burst of oxidative stress, which can then contribute to the post-exertional fatigue that is discussed in the research and that a lot of people experience. We also see alterations in immune cell gene expression. So interleukin 10 is an immune modulating compound, and toll-like receptor 4 is a receptor found on the surface of various immune cells, which is involved in the inflammatory response. And increases in this gene expression would indicate that these individuals are going to be much more sensitive within the context of things like dysbiosis and leaky gut. Interestingly, in this review, there weren't actually any issues or changes from a pro-inflammatory perspective. So these patients with chronic fatigue didn't have an increase in pro-inflammatory molecules, but we did see many other changes that explain the relationship between chronic fatigue syndrome and exercise. Now, put a little bit more simply, what we also see in people with chronic fatigue syndrome is leaky gut being much more pronounced. So when we exercise, studies have shown that for example, in a 10-kilometer run, intestinal permeability or leaky gut is something that naturally develops. Both the mechanical up and down nature on the intestines by running, but also because of the distribution of blood from the lining of the gut to the muscles, so we have the energy to exercise, that has an impact on the health of the gut. But in those with chronic fatigue syndrome, this seems to be kind of almost heightened. There is increased leaky gut. That is going to contribute to inflammation, oxidative stress, brain fog, and this post-exertional malaise. And this is why it's so unique, because some people will be able to do a little bit. Others may be able to do a moderate amount compared to others, but some won't be able to do any. And I've certainly worked with clients with CFS whereby exercise just has not been part of their program, because even a walk is too much and they end up bedbound for 2-3 days afterwards. So it is very unique. You have to kind of trust and listen to your body about what's right for you at this point in time. The danger of doing nothing is obviously that it increases the risk of kind of just becoming more and more deconditioned, making it even harder to start when we're able to. So again, that's why there is this kind of debate that happens about what is best for the individual. We want to try and do something, but it shouldn't exacerbate any symptoms at the same time. Now, when we think about hormones, apologies, this looks horribly complicated, but I'm going to really simplify this for us. This was my dissertation or my research project. I had to create a sort of a mechanistic diagram of my research. And all I want us to kind of really touch on here is how everything we've mentioned so far, primarily through one of two pathways, either inflammation or oxidative stress, can contribute to the receptor of cortisol on the cell becoming resistant. Now, if you think that cortisol isn't just this stress hormone that is produced at times of stress, it's an anti-inflammatory, immune modulating compound. Think of your glucocorticoid medications in hospitals, for example. For cortisol to work, it has to pass through the receptor on the cell, enter the cell, then enter our nucleus, where it's able, to modify genetic expression. And that can lead to the production of anti-inflammatory molecules. So now you can see that when you've got resistance at the cellular level, cortisol can't enter the cell, and therefore cortisol can't do its job. And part of that job is as an anti-inflammatory hormone. So we end up in an inflamed state. And we all know now the fact that inflammation is a common driver of most chronic complex conditions that we see in the modern world. It's not the cause, it's the middleman. The next question becomes, well, what is contributing to that inflammation in the first place? Is it early life stressors? Is it something within the digestive system? Is it something related to an infection like a virus, which we're about to touch on? Is it related to nutrient deficiencies in just our diet? Is it related to a lack of sleep? Is it related to an environmental toxin? So the list goes on, and this is really the purpose of today, to help you understand where you might need to go if you're experiencing chronic fatigue syndrome and don't feel like you yet have an understanding of why. So as well as imbalances in cortisol, we also have some research indicating that there can be imbalances in the thyroid hormone. Now, this is ultimately something that should be ruled out at the very beginning, and it's very likely your GP would have ruled out thyroid dysfunction as a cause of your chronic fatigue. But we do see low 3T3 syndrome, and we don't always get tested for T3 when we go to our GP. T4 is the primary thyroid hormone that gets tested routinely, but T4 is relatively biologically inactive. T4 gets converted to T3, and T3 is the main biologically active hormone from a thyroid perspective. And therefore, we absolutely have to ensure that we're being tested for T3 as well as T4. We also want to ensure we're being tested for the antibodies of the thyroid, but that's going down another rabbit hole. And then infections and inflammation. I would argue that the childhood adverse experiences, the digestive system, and this section are probably the most common factors that we need to be considering. Most people are aware of the research and the discussions around viral infections being a triggering event for chronic fatigue syndrome. And this is an absolutely brilliant paper that reminds us that it's not just related to things like the Epstein-Barr virus, but we have slightly less well-known viruses such as the Ross River virus, enteroviruses, parvovirus B19, and some of the other sort of herpes viruses that can all contribute to chronic fatigue syndrome via many different mechanisms that we don't need to worry too much about today. The takeaway is that a viral infection is a common driver of chronic fatigue syndrome. And what's really interesting is there is this hit and run theory around viruses and infections and chronic fatigue syndrome. And the hit and run theory essentially proposes that viruses trigger the disease, cause immune abnormalities and leave dysfunction within the immune system that can then contribute actually to also autoimmunity as well. And in the sort of hit and run theory, you may actually eventually clear the infection. So on testing, you may not find the triggering events. You may have eventually managed to successfully eradicate, or how should I put it, or deal with the infection. But what I describe as the collateral damage is left, the inflammation, the dysbiosis, the oxidative stress. And we see in the research that these things can become vicious cycles. So a viral infection might come in, it creates inflammation, oxidative stress, it causes dysfunction within your system, within your body. You deal with the virus, but the dysfunction is now feeding off one another. And this is where we've kind of lost resiliency. This is where we actually enter a new sort of set point from a physiological perspective. And this is why sometimes trying to chase the one root cause to your condition is futile, because it's accumulative. Even in this situation of a viral infection, my perspective on this is you still have to ask, well, why did the viral infection trigger the condition at that point in time? Because it's highly possible that if in a parallel world, let's say, where your history was just slightly different, the exposure to that virus wouldn't go on to contribute to chronic fatigue syndrome. Hence, we have to know your entire health history from childhood onwards. What could have been accumulating from a wear and tear perspective that led to that event being your triggering event? It's the same thing as antibiotics triggering the onset of chronic digestive issues or chronic fatigue. There was likely the diversity of that microbiome was probably already somewhat compromised, not to a level where you were symptomatic, but enough so that when you had that stress then into the system, you never returned back to your initial state of health. And then inflammation itself has been directly related to fatigue. So again, what's driving this inflammation in you as a unique individual? And that's where understanding your timeline and your overall life story is so important. And that's why, for me, I think functional medicine is a very powerful model when we're trying to help people improve their health. And what about environmental toxins? Well, over the last close to 5 years, I've been working a lot with people who have mold-related illness. And we do have published evidence showing us that mycotoxins have been associated with chronic fatigue syndrome. Mycotoxins are volatile compounds found in the air that we breathe in. They're so small molecularly that they can be absorbed through our skin. And they're essentially metabolites of mold. So individuals who have lived in a moldy, water-damaged, damp property are potentially at risk of going on to develop various types of conditions. It doesn't have to be chronic fatigue syndrome. That would be one of the potential outcomes. The challenge here is it's very hard to know whether you have mold in your property. I've worked with clients whereby they didn't realize until they moved a book cabinet that behind the book cabinet there was just mold everywhere. And most people don't move their book cabinets for years. And therefore, we sometimes need to do a little check of our property to ensure there isn't something environmentally in that house which is contributing to our fatigue. So you can ask yourself, have you ever lived, worked, stayed in a property that's had a known water leak, or that's had any visible mold, or that was just very damp, or that had a musty kind of smell, maybe indicating there was a dampness within the property? Did your condition, did your health issues start when you moved into a certain property? Did they improve when you left a property? How do you feel when you go away for a long weekend, or you spend much more time outside? I used to always think that when people went on holiday and they felt better, that it was likely there was a big stress connection to their health issues. And actually, as they relaxed and were lying on a beach, they just felt better. But actually, another potential explanation is also going to be that they're out a property that is making them ill. Sometimes it's referred to as sick building syndrome. The building is sick, and therefore the inhabitants are sick. It's almost like a metaphor for our microbiome. If our microbiome is sick, we are sick. And if we are sick, our microbiome is sick. So mycotoxins, you can test for them in the urine. It's a urinary test where we're looking to see whether people have a high, what we call body burden of these toxins. And if so, we need to support that person eliminate them. So we're sort of talking about a detoxification program to support the elimination of these toxins. Again, I've done 3 different podcast episodes now, one in particular with Dr. Jill Christer, who is a leading expert in the world when it comes to mold-related illness and treating mycotoxin. She's got an amazing book called Break the Mold, which is a very practical book for the public around how you can detoxify from mycotoxins when they've been detected present in the urine. And for some reason, my slide deck won't move forwards. Bear with me, everyone. Okay. We're back. And then energy. So this, for me, as we mentioned at the beginning, is the crux of chronic fatigue syndrome. And if you listen to one of the most recent episodes of the podcast with Ray Griffiths, we could argue that mitochondrial dysfunction is at the crux of almost every health condition. The reason being is they're one of the smaller components of the cell. And if they're not healthy, the cell can't be healthy. If the cell isn't healthy, the organ or tissue that it's kind of part of can't be healthy. If the organ or the tissue can't be healthy, the system can't be healthy. If the system can't be healthy, we as a whole organism can't be healthy. So we can work from the biggest to the smallest, and we want to work simultaneously in both directions ultimately. So to try and sort of be non-biased and to provide an evidence-based approach to this to some degree, there was a systematic review done looking at mitochondria in chronic fatigue syndrome in 2020. The conclusion was that it's difficult to establish the role of mitochondria in the pathomechanisms of CFS. However, I must sort of argue and debate that. We've got a lot of information showing us that there is a relationship here. Just as one example, this paper confirming that there seems to be imbalances in mitochondrial function. And how can't there be? If we think that the mitochondria are our energy producing factories, is one of the definitions we can use, and we're talking about chronic fatigue syndrome, there's no way that they can't be involved, because we're talking about an energy deficiency. So mitochondria can be improved in numerous ways. Diet does play a role. Exercise does play a role. Sunlight does play a role. Our light environment plays a role. We want to try and get as much full spectrum sunlight as possible. And we want to limit the blue light that we're exposed to through all of our technological devices. research has shown that even 1 hour at nighttime of using an iPad reduces your melatonin production by 50%. Melatonin isn't just a sleep hormone, it's a potent antioxidant, and it's important for your mitochondria. And your mitochondria also produce a degree of melatonin. To recover from chronic fatigue ultimately is going to be supported by the deepest, most restful sleep possible. And therefore, doing everything we can to optimize melatonin production is also going to be really important here. And then finally, I think from memory, the brain. So this is really interesting. If you're not familiar with the Dr. Gupta program, just give it a little Google. This is a little visual that he created to kind of support his work. And you can sort of see the numbers that we can follow here. So you've got some of the predisposing factors that we listed earlier, which includes genetic predisposing factors. You've got acute psychological stress, which is almost always a part of someone's story and someone's timeline. And then you've got other types of stress. You could call them biological stressors, viral infections, bacterial infections, environmental toxins. These three things are all interconnected and contributing to wear and tear and dysfunction within components of the brain, which then can lead to a chronic sympathetic arousal state, i.e., a stress state. And we're talking physiologically here. We're not talking necessarily emotionally. The body is in a state of stress. That can also compound with immune dysfunction, adrenal dysfunction, and this oxidative stress. That's going to drive various symptoms ranging from gut issues to sort of soft tissue issues. That could be cramps or pain. It will contribute to cognitive difficulties, brain fog, poor word recall, poor memory recall, autonomic dysfunction, so things like POTS or getting lightheaded and dizzy when you come up to standing. These things can all then drive further sensitivity and dysfunction in these parts of the brain. And we end up in a very kind of hypervigilant, very sensitive state. So in this situation, for me, in my experience, this is someone who has become so sensitive to their environment that they can't tolerate supplements. They can barely tolerate any foods. They might be down to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different foods that they can eat without symptoms. Sometimes they're very sensitive to light and noise. And it's just a brain and a body that has become overly sensitized as a result of these chronic exposures and dysfunctions. Another way that he talks about this is kind of kindling. So the kindling occurs when an organism is exposed repeatedly to an initial subthreshold stimulus. So if you're continually being exposed to something that's subthreshold, it can develop into essentially a hypersensitivity. The system becomes charged or kindled, and it sustains that arousal with basically no stimulus anymore. So the stimulus is gone, but it's as if it's still there. And again, this can come back to sorts of infections, to toxins, and to psycho-emotional spiritual stresses. And normally they're all there within someone's timeline as well. So we have to be mindful of this kind of neurological and brain component sometimes to chronic fatigue syndrome, even irritable bowel syndrome, and also fibromyalgia. These kind of what I refer to as diagnoses of exclusion. They're not really telling you what's wrong with you, but you have this cluster of symptoms that are used to then diagnose one of these conditions. So in summary, there are numerous factors that influence energy production, and they range from psychological to environmental and biological. We have to really think about our entire health history. What was our lifestyle and what was our health like growing up? What were our parents' lives and health like? What was my or your mum's health like during pregnancy? Was she exposed to any stresses during pregnancy that, again, would have been sending messages to you as a fetus about what the world is like? We have to tailor the program around the individual, not the diagnosis. So there's a lovely saying in functional medicine, which is treat the individual, not the disease. So it's not, I have chronic fatigue syndrome, what should I do? We have to understand your timeline, your story, your journey, what's happened in your life that could contribute to this diagnosis that you've received. And as a result of this, I always encourage people to not obsess about trying to find the one cause, because it's very possible there isn't one. Or if there was, that it's no longer actually detectable. And as we've discussed, you're left with the collateral damage. So it's then about cultivating health. It's about building resiliency by focusing on your story and you as an individual rather than the label. So interventions are very hard to do because we can't talk about interventions for all of the things we've discussed today, but we do have resources on our YouTube channel with experts in a lot of the things that we've been discussing that we can all go away and kind of digest. But I wanted to try and give some form of what I see as the foundations of most health programs that really can make a profound difference. And for chronic fatigue syndrome in particular, I would advocate for a low-carb diet. I know Dr. Sarah Myhill will go a bit further and talk about the paleo-ketogenic diet. I don't necessarily think we have to go all the way to ketosis, but certainly in my experience, a low-carb, moderate protein, higher fat diet can work well, and that generally is more favorable to mitochondrial health as well. Infrared light therapy can be incredibly helpful for people with chronic fatigue syndrome. And I've given you a link here. I know you can't sort of click on the slides, but maybe take a screenshot if you're on your laptop right now, or make a note of the website. If you just Google EMR Tech light therapy, it will be the first website that you find. Infrared light therapy has been shown to be very helpful for mitochondrial function and for chronic fatigue syndrome. And they're basically my favorite company. I'm not sort of affiliated with them per se. I have one of their devices that we use just for sort of general health. Infrared sauna therapy. The company that I recommend in the UK is GetFit. They have an amazing customer services. You can give them a call, explain what's going on with your health, and they'll have a chat with you about what might be the most appropriate product. Infrared sauna therapy, again, can be incredibly helpful for most of the things that we've been discussing today as well. Really focus on a healthy circadian rhythm. If you can, try and expose yourself to sunrise and sunset, even if it's opening a window so you're getting the full spectrum of light onto your skin or through your eyes. The more I read, the more I believe, the more research I find showing us that sunshine is one of the most underrated forms of therapy. Ultimately, we are designed to be outside pretty much all day if you think about our evolution. And a lot of people are starting to talk about how one of the biggest problems in the modern world is our light environment. We get very little full spectrum natural sunlight anymore because we work indoors, we stay indoors most of the time, and when we're outside, often we're either in long sleeves and trousers or we're wearing sun cream. So we really have to focus on that. And I know it sounds like it couldn't be that helpful. I really appreciate that. But I cannot stress enough how many clients who have really focused on this habit or behavior have reaped the benefits. So even if it's at the weekends to begin with, trying to spend more time in your day outside, or whether it's trying to get and see the sunrise and the sunset. The reason why we want to see the sunrise and the sunset is partly because of the spectrum of light and the frequencies of light that we're exposed to at that point in time. And that's where the infrared light therapy can be helpful, because it's kind of a modern day version of being at one with nature. Breath work has been shown to be incredibly helpful for both chronic fatigue syndrome and many other conditions. There's actually a recent blog post on the Transformational Breath website, which is why I've given you their link here, around how transformational breath work can be helpful for chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm actually, at the moment, a transformational breath facilitator intern. So I'm working with clients one-to-one as part of my training. And I think it's one of the most powerful sort of tools within my toolkit, certainly. But you can also consider body work, a chiropractor, an osteopath, massage therapy. These can be incredibly powerful. And I've spoken with so many osteopaths and chiros and now massage therapists over the years who have witnessed some really amazing healing through their work. And the easiest, quickest way to describe this is profound emotional releases. Sometimes with the correct manipulation, for example, from a chiropractor or osteo, or even just having physical touch, which a lot of us are deficient in the modern world, these things can open up previous trauma, stress, emotions that weren't expressed at the time of the event. And again, there is a lot of research showing us that emotional suppression, if we're not able to articulate and express how we truly feel, that impacts us physiologically significantly. So body work is a great way of supporting the body. We mentioned the sunshine. Even on a cloudy day, you're still getting that light onto your skin and through your eyes. And grounding, also called earthing. You can go to Groundology for various devices if you aren't able to get barefoot on Mother Earth on a daily basis. You know, spending half an hour, if you've got a garden or a local park that you can get to, take your shoes and socks off and go barefoot. Most of us know how good that feels. But we now have published evidence in peer-reviewed journals showing us that this actually supports our health and well-being. It's been shown to be anti-inflammatory, and we've been discussing inflammation for the last hour. Ultimately, it's been shown to improve and speed up the healing process of cuts and burns, and it ultimately supports mitochondrial function. So again, it sounds very silly and a little bit woo-woo when you first hear about these things, but we now have scientific evidence showing us their benefits. Now, the Groundology website, they're just one company that basically offer various kind of bits of kit that allow us to ground when we can't get access to some grass. You can ground on tarmac, but it's not quite as effective. So Groundology offer things like mats that you can stand on, you can put next to your laptop so your arms are resting on them. And they also do things like bed sheets and pillows. And you basically have a mat that you put under your sheets. That mat has a cable that then goes to a plug. You put the plug into your mains, and via the mains in your home, you ground yourself. And there are people who have healed themselves from chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, etc., using this kind of principle. Obviously, you can't beat just getting outside in Mother Nature, but many of us don't have that sort of luxury these days with work, family, etc. So these generally are some of the things that I think are the most helpful if we can get consistent with them. There are obviously some very specific things that we would do based on the specific things going on. So if you have Sibo, there are various things we would want to do for a Sibo protocol. If you have a high viral load, there are things that we would want to do to support your immune system deal with the virus, including herbal antivirals and antiviral nutrients. And again, we have podcast episodes with the likes of Benjamin Brown talking about what are nutrients that have been shown in the research to have antiviral properties. Things like vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin D, glutamine, licorice root extract. They have published evidence showing us that they can be helpful here. So I would encourage you to, over the coming days, weeks and months, if you haven't already, maybe digest some of the podcast episodes on our YouTube channel to get more information about a lot of the things that I've highlighted today. And obviously, I'm going to be going into a lot more detail about a lot of these sorts of topics over the coming weeks and months as well. So thank you for listening, everyone. I can see that there are probably at least a couple of questions. So I'm going to stop share the screen so I can have a little look at what's been written in. And guys, if you've got questions, now is the time. So I've got a little bit of time now to try and answer everything that I can for you. Karen's asked whether you get an email copy of the presentation. I'm not sure whether that goes out or not, Karen. You'll certainly get a recording of the presentation that goes out. I don't know whether you're going to get a PDF. I don't think you will, but if there's anything that particularly that you want, let me know. I can always put it into the chat box maybe for you. Okay, let's see what's in the chat box. So Sarah's asked whether infrared light is the same as a SAD lamp. It's not. I have a very good friend and colleague who is kind of my go-to resource on sort of light therapy at this point in time while I try and catch up with him, so to speak. And he's a much more of an advocate of infrared light over a SAD lamp. They both have value. You know, there's obviously evidence behind SAD lamps, and a lot of people have had significant improvement in their seasonal affective disorder by using one. But infrared light for me is on another level, is my kind of understanding of this. So I would vote for an infrared light over a SAD lamp. So someone else has asked whether I have experience with recovery factors, which is a supplement which contains porcine serum-derived polypeptide complex. I haven't actually. I have no experience with that, but it sounds very interesting. My question would be, what's the mechanism behind why you recommend a low-carb diet? Good question. So firstly, it's just anecdotal in the sense that I found it to be by far the most well not tolerated, but the one that provides the best benefits. However, we do have, I guess, slightly more mechanistic understanding here. So when it comes to mitochondrial function, for example, mitochondria prefer, put simply, more of a high-fat, low-carb diet. So there's real debate here in the nutrition world around, you know, what is the best diet? And it varies. It's going to be varied based on not only what's best for you based on your physiology, but what about your culture? What about your ethical decisions? What about what you have access to, etc.? So it's a really tricky one because it requires really a one-on-one conversation here. But low-carb diets, generally, I find people experience better blood sugar control, which obviously makes a degree of sense. They are somewhat better from a mitochondrial perspective. And I would argue that I think a lot of people run better on fat rather than carbohydrates. The main thing for me, from a general perspective, is ensuring that the carbs you're having are obviously slow release, because a lot of people with chronic fatigue will have a bit of a roller coaster ride with their blood sugar levels. Because again, if you don't have enough energy at a cellular level, you're also likely going to be prone to more dysglycemia or blood sugar irregularities. So stabilizing blood sugar is like the bread and butter of having stable energy. And then obviously we just are trying to actually improve energy production. Also, because quite a big chunk of people with chronic fatigue syndrome have imbalances within the microbiome, such as Sibo, we saw the study where 77% had Sibo. A lot of people with Sibo will do much better on a low-carb diet. So there's kind of the gut connection there as well. Another question is, where can you get all the specialized virus, etc. testing? So ultimately, that would be working with a practitioner, a nutritional therapist or functional medicine practitioner. The viral testing, as far as I know, is not something that's accessible just to the public. Obviously, HealthPath do the gut testing. We have access to some of the other testing when working with practitioners. But yes, in regards to the specialized testing, that would be available via a practitioner. I don't think it's available otherwise. Someone's asked, any time to expand on firmicutes? So my initial thought is I don't want it to be a red herring. And what I mean by that is I'm not someone who necessarily advocates for specific organisms being involved in the overall complex of the microbiome. So what else is going on within that ecosystem that matters? So for those of you that don't know, firmicutes are one of the main families of bacteria within the microbiome. They've been shown to be out of balance, so to speak, within some of the research on chronic fatigue syndrome. But I don't think it's the be all and end all. That in isolation is fairly insignificant, I would say. It's what else is going on that matters. So do you have any more sort of pathogenic organisms that have overgrown? Is there intestinal permeability? Is there any inflammation? Do you have an overgrowth in the small intestine? So a bit of an overgrowth of firmicutes in the large intestine as a single test result, I wouldn't actually do anything about, if that makes sense. So someone else has basically asked whether what we've been discussing today, whether a lot of the principles can be used for fibromyalgia, and the answer I would say is yes. There's a really intimate overlap between chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. I can't remember the stats, but a good chunk of people with CFS have fibro, and a good chunk of people with fibro have CFS. Add in IBS, and these three conditions are all deeply connected ultimately. Someone else has asked whether I have heard of Youth and Earth supplements, and I haven't, so I can't recommend them, unfortunately. And someone else has written in saying that their GP doesn't believe in ME. Can you recommend any clinics? There is the, what's it called? Is it the Health Optimization Clinic? If you Google Alex Howard, I'm pretty sure it's the Health Optimization Clinic. There's also the London Clinic of Nutrition, where I used to do some consultancy with them, who have some absolutely brilliant practitioners well versed in ME or chronic fatigue. And then obviously there are practitioners at HealthPath if you want to work kind of online with a practitioner who have good experience with chronic fatigue ME as well. Someone's asked whether everyone with fatigue could benefit from taking CoQ10 and carnitine, or does it depend on the person? I think it very much depends on the person. Go back to the idea of treat the individual, not the disease. I'm really anti the idea that, you say, because you have this diagnosis or this condition, you should take this supplement or this specific dietary plan. I know I mentioned as a theme, I would move away from a high carb diet, but that's a general rule. Someone has mentioned that they're taking a supplement called Mito-ATP and have asked my thoughts on it for helping mitochondria. It will certainly support them, Catherine. I think the main thing to be mindful of is, there are lots of things we can do without having to supplement to support them. So again, the grounding, the red light therapy or sunshine, certain amounts of movement, and then diet. But Mito-ATP essentially, if it's the one I'm thinking of, is a product to essentially support mitochondrial energy production. So from that perspective, it's absolutely going to be okay. Someone has asked, how will a high-fat diet work if coronary heart disease is also an issue? So that opens up a big conversation that I won't get into here, unfortunately, around fat, cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and what actually drives this. It's something that how shall I answer this generally? It's not something that I would rule out per se, let's put it like that. But it is a very controversial conversation. But generally speaking, the idea that a high-fat diet is the primary cause of some of these cardiovascular diseases has been strongly questioned ultimately. And therefore, you may want to work with a practitioner ultimately and have a proper discussion around that. Someone's asked if the Health Path plate is a low-carb diet. I wouldn't describe it as low-carb per se. It's probably more in the moderate category ultimately. But you can obviously tweak the recipes to make it lower carb very easily, just by reducing the portion sizes of some of the carbohydrates and increasing your fats and your proteins within those recipes. Interestingly, someone's DNA test recommended a low-carb diet, but I missed the fruit and potatoes. Do you think the Randall cycle is behind this metabolic gridlock that can happen? So I don't think you necessarily have to not eat any fruit or potatoes for that matter, but you just need to be very mindful of your portion sizes. You know, I would certainly recommend that you have some berries, for example, that are generally kind of obviously low sugar fruits. Those can be important for various reasons. So you don't have to go so low that you're not consuming a little bit of fruit, and, you know, a bit of potato, depending on what else is going on in your diet on that day, I would also argue potentially could be okay. So again, it's quite, you don't have to be overly black and white, I guess, so to speak. So if you miss them, you know, there's a balance between doing what you're told is best for you physically, but also nourishing yourself, nourishing your mind, your spirit at the same time. And I'm a huge advocate for getting the best of both worlds. Optimal Health Clinic. Someone's confirmed that that's the name of the clinic. Thank you. Ooh, someone's challenging me here now in regards to memory. So someone's asked, what are normal cortisol levels for AM and PM respectively? Off the top of my head, I couldn't say, I can't remember, because they're always on test results. I've never had to kind of memorize it. But if you've done a cortisol test, it's going to be the reference range. So the lab will tell you within the test results what is typically a normal level. And it will depend on whether you're looking at salivary cortisol or urinary cortisol in regards to obviously the kind of the reference range as well. So with adrenal fatigue, you're ultimately going to be looking at low levels in the AM and the PM. So adrenal fatigue is kind of a bit like a flatlining test result, ultimately. And someone's mentioned that supplements can sometimes overload their digestive system, which would suggest that there's obviously some digestive work to be done. So depending on what supplements you feel can overload it, it may be that having something a bit more gut specific for a period of time and working with a practitioner to help you from that dietary perspective could be really helpful as well. Someone's asked whether I think you can maintain good health if you have had most or all of your colon removed due to Crohn's disease. It's a tricky one. I don't know what to say there, to be honest. I don't know. I think it will depend on so many other things likely as well. It's not an easy question to answer, I'm afraid. Do I think you can be in good health? Yes, I would like to say so. I mean, I'm someone that always wants to have hope, that is very positive about the ability of an individual to have good health within the context of their history. But obviously, I can't say for sure. It depends what else is going on ultimately and how well your digestive system at this point in time, but also the rest of your systems are operating. So it's a tricky one. But yes, I'm going to say you can, because there would be no point in saying otherwise, and there's no point in saying in thinking otherwise. I'm a huge advocate of this theme of resilience. There's lots of research on resilience. There's more and more stuff coming out on it. And part of what makes someone resilient is, put very simply, their mindset. But things like hope and confidence are key parts of it. So it's being mindful of how we frame our situation, the thoughts that we have, the emotions that we experience, and consciously not taking control per se, but what I do like to say is consciously cultivating positive emotional states, because we see very clearly in the research that our emotional state influences our physical state and vice versa. So if every morning you consciously start your day by listing 3 things, 5 things that you're grateful for, that is literally changing your physiology and improving your immune system, and that's going to improve other systems as well. So we have research showing us that gratitude practice loving meditation practices, they influence positively various parameters of our health. And therefore, again, it comes back to this kind of mind-body connection. So consciously cultivating positive emotional states, love, gratitude, joy, peace, they will help you maintain good health, even in the context of everything else that might be going on. So I talk about the quadrants of resiliency. You've got physical resilience, things like diet and exercise and sauna therapy, cold showers and things like this. But you've got mental, emotional and spiritual resiliency, or just mental, emotional and spiritual health as well. And in all programs, I would argue that we want to get to a point where we're kind of focused on all four. I think in the modern world, we're overly focused on the physical, and we're not very good. You could say, especially us Brits, when it comes to kind of emotional well-being and spiritual well-being. You know, we're not necessarily taught as children to express ourselves properly. We're often told to shut up, be quiet, don't cry, you're a boy, all of these kind of themes that we see in modern society. But I'm a huge advocate for our emotional well-being being just as important as what's going on with things like our diet, our sleep patterns and things like this. So I would encourage everyone to, be conscious and raise their awareness around what's going on in your head with your thinking, with your cognition, essentially, but also with your emotional well-being. So if you find yourself in a real bad mood, the idea of mindfulness being you're kind of just witnessing what's going on. So you're kind of experiencing anger. You aren't anger. You're not angry. You're experiencing this emotion that will pass. And when you take that slight degree of objectivity to your experience, you can then also analyze it a little bit more. So why am I angry right now? What's happened in the last few hours? Am I actually hungry? Have I not nourished myself properly? Or, is my blood sugar levels low? Have I been thinking unhelpful thoughts without actually realizing it because I'm not connected with my cognition or my thoughts? So there's lots that we can explore to support ourselves from that health perspective, without having to just think about, what's wrong with me, which I think is a common mistake that I see in clinic, where people are getting overly fixated on knowing what's wrong. And sometimes it gets to a point where we're thinking so much about what's wrong and what needs fixing, we're actually doing very little about just cultivating health. Whereas if we focus on what we need to do and trust the process, that by doing these things, we are going to improve, it completely changes our whole paradigm and way of living. So focusing on cultivating health, what are the habits that you can bring into your day that you're confident, based on what you've read, maybe some of what I've said, etc., that things will improve with time. My final point here, because I'm waffling a little bit, is patience. If you've been struggling for a long time, or if you've just had quite a tough life, we have to be mindful that that's going to impact how long it's going to take to recover. And often I can work with people for 1-2 years to get them well. Because not only has there been a lot that's gone on in their lives, not only do they have a lot going on with their health right now, but we don't know what's going to come up in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. There will be new stresses that might pop into our lives as well that are going to influence this. Okay, guys, I will stop there because I can talk about these things all day, as you might have gathered. But I hope that's been helpful. I hope it's been informative. I hope it's given some of you with chronic fatigue some routes to explore that you might not have yet been aware of. And obviously these are going to be a monthly webinar. So you'll have another 11 of these as we go through this year, and I'll likely add some bonus webinars as well, because there are quite a few topics that I want to kind of share with you all. So enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your week, take care of yourselves, and we're here to support you in any way that we can. So hopefully I'll speak to some of you soon.